Hi everybody. Today we're going to talk about light in plant growth. Light has always been very interesting to me, and if you look at this list, you see a list of some of the plant processes that light is involved in. So starting out with photosynthesis, we know that light is important in that process. Light also plays a role in the formation of pigments within the plant, and these would be pigments that you would see in leaves and stems. The growth habit of the plant, is the plant going to be tall and leggy, or is it going to be short and branched? The overall size, flowering, fruiting, seed germination, the onset of dormancy, the onset of cold hardiness. These are important ways that plants have to get ready for the winter dormant season. Leaf movements, the formation of storage organs like bulbs and corms, fall color in the leaves, and leaf senescence. Senescence refers to the dropping of the leaves in the fall from plants. So there are three important characteristics of light that we want to concern ourselves with. The first characteristic is the quality of light. And from a plant's perspective, quality refers to the color of light or the wavelength of light. So if you look at the picture, you're looking at what's called the electromagnetic spectrum. And over on the far right-hand side where it says radio, that refers to radio waves, which are electromagnetic waves that have very long wavelengths. And then over on the left-hand side, you see cosmic and gamma rays. So this is electromagnetic radiation that has a very short wavelength. Well, in the middle left of the diagram, you see what we call the visible spectrum of light. So if you take sunlight and pass it through little droplets of water that are suspended in the air, you have a rainbow. And in that rainbow, you see all the constituent colors or wavelengths of white light. And there's an acronym that you may have learned back in grade school called ROY, G, BIV. So ROY, red, orange, yellow, G is for green, BIV, blue, indigo, and violet. So those are the colors of the rainbow. A second important characteristic of light is the quantity of light that plants receive. So quantity is referring to the amount of light given off by a light source. And for plants growing outside, the light source is going to be the sun. However, sometimes we grow plants in indoor environments and the light source could be some type of artificial lighting. Now quantity, or the amount of light, is correlated with something called light intensity. And light intensity is something that we can measure with a light meter. So we all have cameras on our phones, and those cameras have a built-in light meter. And that light meter is sensing the amount of light or the quantity of light in a particular setting so that it can optimize the settings on the camera so you get the best picture. So light meters are something that you can purchase through different stores. They're valuable if you're growing a lot of plants indoors and you want to know what the light intensity is in different rooms of your house, for example. That can be measured with a light meter. A third important characteristic of light is what we call photoperiod. Photoperiod is the duration of the lighted period. And maybe a better way to think about photoperiod is it is the amount of light that a plant receives in a 24-hour period or 1 day. So if a plant is growing outside and it's getting 14 hours of light, then we could say the photoperiod is 14 hours, and then there must be 10 hours of darkness, because 14 plus 10 would equal the 24 hours that are in a day. So many species of plant respond to changes in the day length or changes in this photoperiod. And one of these responses is flowering. So we say that plants that respond to photoperiod, and if that is a trigger for flowering, then we say that those plants are photoperiodic, or I should say those plant species are photoperiodic. They respond to the photoperiod, and photoperiod is a trigger that can initiate the flowering process. So when you're growing plants in a nursery situation, and remember way back at the beginning of class we talked about nursery management, which is the outdoor production of ornamental plants. So in nurseries, trees and shrubs are typically grown in rows like you see in these two pictures. And proper spacing is needed to ensure that these plants, the trees or the shrubs, whatever you're growing, is getting adequate light for photosynthesis. So we have to make sure that when we plant these rows that we leave sufficient space between rows so that the plants, each plant, is getting enough light. Now sometimes this leads to a situation where there's wasted space in a nursery, especially when the plants are young. And you can see in these pictures that in between the rows of plants basically is a grass strip. Okay, grass sort of provides a roadway that equipment can move across, so they can go up and down those rows to, access the trees, or if they need to harvest a plant, they have a way in to get that particular tree to harvest it. But wasted space can be a problem. There is something called interplanting, and I want to show you an example of interplanting that comes from southern France. So here's a picture that I found on the internet. This is called agroforestry. So agro from agriculture and forestry, the production of timber. So we're interplanting poplar trees and wheat. So you can see the combine that's running down the rows harvesting the wheat. So we're growing wheat in between these rows of poplar trees. So, the poplar trees are going to take maybe 20 or 30 years to get to a point where they can be harvested. So that's 20 or 30 years worth of, wheat harvests that you can have in this particular situation. So interplanting is a way to kind of use that space between rows. Okay, when it comes to planting in the landscape, for example, around your home, you also have to consider that the plants that you put into the landscape are going to need sufficient space and adequate light for growth. So the general rule of thumb is the taller plants should always be placed to the rear, so that is closer to the house or closest to the house. And then the medium-sized plants would be in front of the tall ones, and then the shortest plants would be towards the front. So if you look at this picture, you can see kind of a taller red shrub. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but that's kind of in the background close to the garage. And then you have shorter shrubs in front of that. And then finally, out in front, you have hostas and other ground covers and annual plants, which would be the shortest plants. So the tallest material in the back, the shortest material in the front. Okay, light is an important consideration to remember when you're pruning a hedge. So there is a correct way and an incorrect way to prune hedges. So if you look at the picture on the top where it says correct, that is the correct shape that hedges should be pruned into. So they should be a little bit wider on the bottom, and they should narrow as you go up towards the top, and then be relatively flat across the top. So the incorrect picture shows the incorrect way to prune a hedge. And the problem with the picture on the right is simply a matter of light. So if a hedge is pruned into that fan shaped, then what happens is the upper branches are going to shade the lower branches of the hedge, and if those leaves on the lower branches are not getting enough light, they're going to die, and eventually branches are going to die, and you're going to end up with holes in your hedge. So the correct way is what you see in the bottom picture: wider towards the bottom of the hedge and then tapering up towards the top. Fruit trees also need plenty of light, and you could have an entire class on how to prune fruit trees, but they've discovered that pruned apple trees, or fruit trees in general, outyield non-pruned fruit trees. So in general, what you want to do with fruit trees is kind of open up the center of the fruit trees so that you can get light into the center. Light is necessary for the formation of that red blush color that you see on peaches and nectarines. So if the center of the plant is open, then the fruit, if you're growing peaches and nectarines, for example, is going to be receiving enough light so they develop this red blush color, which is going to help improve the quality of the fruit. All right, I want to talk about another aspect of light, or we should say the lack thereof, and that's called etiolation. So light is necessary for chlorophyll production in most angiosperms. So in other words, in order for a shoot or a leaf to develop chlorophyll, you have to have light. And remember, chlorophyll is that green colored pigment that you find in the cells of leaves, and chlorophyll is an important pigment in photosynthesis. Light inhibits internode elongation, so plants grown in full sunlight tend to be shorter and better branched than plants grown in more shaded environments. So this is etiolation defined. Etiolation is the development of a plant or plant parts in the absence of light. So here are two good pictures that show what happens when plants are kept in the dark. So regardless of which picture you're looking at, the plant in the right was the plant that was grown in the dark. It was not exposed to sunlight. So you can see that the stems are very long and stretched out, and the stems are kind of a whitish yellow color. The plant is growing very tall and spindly. And then if you look at the plant on the left-hand side in each of those pictures, those were plants that were grown in the light, so they are much shorter and they're green. Why? Well, like we just said, you need light to manufacture chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is that green colored pigment. Another interesting aspect of light that applies to the production of cauliflower is something called blanching. Blanching is where you cover part of a plant to exclude light. And it's a common practice in fields of cauliflower to blanch the cauliflower heads to help maintain the milky white color and mild flavor of the cauliflower. So how do you cover a cauliflower head? Well, you do it with the leaves. So if you see in the top picture, this particular person has pulled up the leaves of the cauliflower plant and kind of wrapped those leaves around that developing head of cauliflower and then tied all that together to exclude light. So in the lower picture, you can kind of peek in and see that cauliflower head developing. Light has been excluded, so it has a nice white color and supposedly a more mild flavor. Now, you don't have to do this when you grow cauliflower. If you don't do this, you're simply going to get a cauliflower head that is maybe a little more on the yellow side and may not have the best flavor. Okay, here's another picture that shows an application of blanching to scallions. So scallions are onions. So as these scallions are growing in their production bed, the farmer will come by with a machine that will mound soil up around the scallions as they grow. So when you push soil up around the stem of the plant, you're excluding light. So if you're excluding light, then you're not able to make chlorophyll, so that tissue is going to remain kind of a white color. And then finally, when the scallions are ready for harvest, they're pulled up, and you can kind of see a very distinct line there. So you can see that the soil was mounded up, perhaps about halfway up those scallion stems. And below the soil line, the stems are kind of a nice white color, and above that, the tops are green. So supposedly this process helps improve the quality of the scallions. This is interesting. So sometimes some plants are difficult to propagate from cuttings. They just don't want to propagate very well from a cutting. But researchers have discovered that cuttings taken from etiolated stock plants produce roots in high percentages. So in other words, if you could grow a plant in the absence of light and then take a cutting from that plant that was etiolated, they have found that those cuttings root in higher percentages. Or another way to do this that I've read about is, rather than keeping the whole plant in the dark, is you can take some tape or some plastic or something that you can use to cover the stem up. So this can be done on a plant that's growing outdoors. So when the new shoots start to develop in the spring, you're going to cover part of that shoot or stem with some type of covering, and you're going to hold this in place with tape. So essentially, you're going to be blanching that part of the stem. You're going to be excluding light. And then when you're ready to make your cutting, you remove the covering, treat the cutting with a rooting hormone, and stick it. And you might find that those blanched etiolated cuttings will root in higher percentages than cuttings from the rest of the plant. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the plant pigments that plants make. We already know about chlorophyll, and we said that chlorophyll is a green-colored pigment that you find in leaves and stems. There's another class of pigments called the carotenoids. These are a class of pigments that reflect light in the yellow to red-orange range, and they absorb blue light. So to us, carotenoids are going to look either orange or yellow in color. Okay, so within the carotenoid class of pigments, there is a certain pigment called carotene, which is an orange-colored pigment, and you find that in pumpkins and carrots. And there's another carotenoid called xanthophyll, which is a yellow pigment. So if you look at this tree, this is a fall color on a tree. You see a lot of yellow in the leaf. So the yellow is from the xanthophyll pigments in that leaf. So why are carotenoids important? Well, they play a role in transferring light energy to chlorophyll A, which is the principal type of chlorophyll that's used in photosynthesis. So other pigments can also absorb light, transfer that light energy to chlorophyll A to help the photosynthetic process move along. So this brings us to the phytochrome system in plants. And what exactly is the phytochrome system? The phytochrome system is a system in plant that allows plants to see the light. It allows plants to record or register the light. We had talked earlier at the beginning of this video how light plays a role in photosynthesis and pigment formation, size, flowering, fruiting, the onset of dormancy. So light's involved in many different plant processes. Plants have to have a way to record or see this light, and that's what the phytochrome system does for plants. So what exactly is phytochrome? Phytochrome is a bluish green colored protein pigment with a special light absorbing portion called a chromophore. Where do you find phytochrome? You find phytochrome in leaf cells. And phytochrome exists in two different forms. There's something called phytochrome red and phytochrome far red. So it's kind of like going to the gas station and you have the choice of filling up with regular unleaded gas or premium unleaded gas. They're both gas, but they're slightly different from one another. So that's kind of way the phytochrome red and far red are. They're both phytochrome, but they're slightly different from one another. And it's important that you understand, we use kind of a shorthand notation to describe these two different variations of phytochrome. So the phytochrome red is the capital P with a little r subscript. That stands for phytochrome red. Phytochrome far red is the capital P with the FR subscript. So this goes back to the electromagnetic spectrum that we discussed earlier in the video. And I wanted to show you where on the spectrum phytochrome red and phytochrome far red absorb light. So phytochrome red absorbs red light in the 660 nanometer wavelength. And phytochrome far red absorbs far red light in the 730 nanometer wavelength of the spectrum. So these are examples of things that are related to phytochrome. So lots of different aspects of plant growth and metabolism are controlled in part by phytochrome. Okay, there are some important things to remember when we talk about the phytochrome system. One thing to remember that helps me understand phytochrome a little bit better is that on your typical sunny day, there's a little bit more red light striking the earth than there is far red light. So if you think back to the electromagnetic spectrum that we just looked at, the far red light is just a little bit further to the right than red light. So they're electromagnetic waves of slightly different wavelengths. So leaves absorb red light. Red light is one of the primary wavelengths of light, along with blue light, that's used in photosynthesis. So leaves are going to be grabbing red light and blue light and using those wavelengths of light for photosynthesis. Far red light, however, will pass right through leaves. Leaves don't absorb far red light because they don't need it for photosynthesis, so it just passes right through the leaf. So plants growing in the shade of taller plants, for example, are getting a lot of far red light. And this is probably the most important thing to remember about phytochrome. So we said earlier that phytochrome is a pigment that you find in leaf cells. And phytochrome can exist in these two forms, red and far red. Now, I use the term pool, but what I'm really referring to is the relative concentration of phytochrome red to far red in the cells of a leaf. So that's what I'm indicating when I use the word pool. So it's the sizes of these pools, or the concentration of red to far red, that's going to determine the biological consequence, or what's going to happen in the plant. And I want to run through a couple examples, a couple case studies of phytochrome. So we're going to look at a few simple. Okay, before we do that, I just wanted to show you this picture. And I remember seeing this picture when I was, taking classes in botany back at the University of Illinois. But this is the basic conversion process. So on the left, you have phytochrome red. And when phytochrome red is exposed to red light, it turns into the phytochrome far red form. When phytochrome far red is exposed to far red light, it turns into the phytochrome red form. So they can switch back and forth depending on which type of light, or the amount of light that's striking those leaves. And then during the night, when there is no sunlight, after the sun sets, there's going to be a slow nighttime conversion. So phytochrome far red will just on its own convert back to the red form. So it's always important to kind of keep this diagram in the back of your head whenever you're thinking about the phytochrome system. Okay, case study number 1. We want to look at a plant growing in full sun. Okay, so this diagram that I just showed you is important. So you have the sun. I think you can find that in the picture. And the sun is producing the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. But we're not concerned with all those other colors. We don't care about green light or yellow light or indigo or blue at this time. We're just kind of going to focus in on red light and far red light, which are both part of the visible part of the spectrum. So it's important when you look at the diagram, you see there's an arrow that says red light. And it's red, right? And it's kind of wide. The wide arrow, or the width of that arrow, kind of relates back to something I said earlier, that the sun produces a little bit more red light than it does far red light. So if you look at the far red light arrow, it's just a little bit skinnier and it's a different color. I kind of made it more of a kind of a burgundy color to indicate that it's a slightly different wavelength than red light. Okay, now when under these situations, leaves are illuminated by sunlight, because there's a little bit more red light than far red light, that means that the majority of the phytochrome is going to be in the far red form. So the far red pool is going to be slightly bigger than the phytochrome red pool. And I've tried to illustrate the sizes of those pools by drawing different size circles. So the bigger circle refers to the bigger pool, the smaller circle refers to the smaller pool. And remember, pool just relates back to the relative concentration or amount of phytochrome far red in the cells of a leaf versus phytochrome red. All right, so now that we kind of understand how these diagrams work, let's think about a plant that's growing in full sunlight. So the biological consequence here is because there's more of the phytochrome in the far red form, the plant is going to grow shorter and be more branched than a plant that was not growing in full sunlight, or that was growing in the shade, for example. So I love this picture. This is a picture of white oak. I'm not sure white oak comes all the way down into Texas. It's something you can definitely see in the Midwest. It may come down to northern Texas, its range. But you're looking at two different white oaks. So you're looking at the same species of tree. The one on the left was growing out in an open field in full sunlight. The tree on the right, however, was growing in a forested situation where it had to compete with other plants for sunlight. So look at the tree on the left, the one that was growing in the field in full sunlight. So it is much shorter and it has better branching. So that is a biological consequence of plants growing in full sunlight. They tend to be shorter and have better branching or more branching. All right, case study number 2. Let's take a look at a plant that's growing in the shade of taller plants. So if you look at this picture, this shows a typical forest or wooded setting. So you see some large trees that are growing very tall. These are what are called the overstory trees. And then kind of growing down closer to the ground, you have what's called the understory vegetation or the understory trees. So these trees in the understory are obviously in a much more shaded environment. The crowns of the taller trees are kind of up there where they can get more light. So as I mentioned earlier, the leaves of plants want to grab that red light because red light along with blue light are used in photosynthesis. So leaves are going to be absorbing red light. Okay, however, the far red light that's produced by the sun is going to be passing right through the leaves. So if you're growing in the understory of taller trees, then you're in an environment where there's much more far red light than there is red light. Okay, so here's the diagram at the right. So you see the sun. You see that the red arrow indicates the red light that the sun is producing, and it makes a little more red light than far red light. The arrow on the right is the far red arrow, so it's a little bit narrower. And then I drew some leaves there, and what I'm showing is the red light gets absorbed by leaves because they use it for photosynthesis, whereas the far red light will pass right through those leaves and get down to the forest floor where those understory plants are growing. Now if you think back to that diagram, this means that if the leaves of the understory plants are exposed to mostly far red light, then the phytochrome in those leaf cells is going to be in the red form predominantly. So the pool of phytochrome red is going to be larger than the pool of phytochrome far red, which is just the reverse that we saw in case study number 1, where we were looking at a plant that was growing in full sunlight. So what is the biological consequence here? Well, plants growing in the shade need to compete for light, so they grow taller and have fewer branches. So let's go back and look at our picture of the white oak trees that we just looked at a bit ago. So we said that the tree on the right was the one that was grown in the forest situation. So it had to compete for light. So when it was an understory tree, it was in an environment that was saturated with far red light. And because of that, there was more phytochrome red in its leaves than phytochrome far red. And the biological result of that is a tree that grows very straight, does not have a lot of branching, and is very tall. So from a forestry perspective, the tree on the right is a much better tree for harvesting. So if you're interested in cutting that tree down, sawing it up into logs, the tree on the right is a much better tree because you have a lot of clear wood that's not going to have knots in it. Whereas the tree on the left, the one that was growing in the open field, full sun situation, has a lot of branching, which is going to mean there's going to be wood with a lot of knots, and you're just not going to get a lot of good logs out of that tree. Okay, here's another way to possibly illustrate that. This isn't the best picture. But this is a flat of tomato seedlings or tomato transplants that's sitting on a bench in the greenhouse. And what I want you to notice is somebody pulled a tomato transplant from the left edge of the flat, from the center of the flat, and from the right edge of the flat. So what you're seeing is the tomato transplants that are on the edges get more light. And because they receive more light, they tend to grow a little bit shorter. Whereas the tomato transplants in the center of the flat are shaded by the transplants around them, so they tend to grow taller and leggier. So there is a term that we use in horticulture called shade tolerance. And this refers to the fact that some species of plants have adapted to lower light environments and are called shade tolerant plants. In other words, they can tolerate the shade. So examples of some shade tolerant plants that you might be familiar with are something called ageratum, ferns, hostas, columbine, dogwood, maple, rhododendron, yews, and many others. Some seeds require light to germinate, and we can look at a third case study, and that would be light-sensitive seeds. So in the diagram at the right, you see the sun. The sun's putting out a little more red light than far red light, as indicated by the width of the arrows. And you see a seed that is on the surface of the soil where it can be exposed to light. So the fact that the seed is absorbing red light and that red light is converting the phytochrome pool to the far red form, so there's going to be a higher concentration of phytochrome far red over phytochrome red in the tissue of the seed. So this is a case where the phytochrome is in the seed itself. All right, so what's going to happen is the seed is going to germinate. So certain seeds require light to germinate, and specifically those seeds need red light to germinate. So seeds requiring light for germination are typically sown on the surface of the growing medium and not covered up at all. So, if you're sowing some seeds, you need to do a little research. And as it turns out, a lot of species that produce a very small, fine seed, those seeds are the ones that do require light for germination. So the best way to sow those seeds is right on the surface of the growing medium and to not cover them up at all with any additional growing medium. Or if you do cover them, just cover them very, very lightly. So we want to make sure that those seeds can get some red light, which will cause them to germinate. Another example of seeds that require light for germination are photodormant weed seeds. So many species of weeds produce seeds, and those seeds can be buried in the ground and they can stay dormant for years just in the soil. And if you come along with something like a rototiller, and let's say you want to make a garden and you till up the soil, so you're turning the soil over and you're taking these seeds that were buried in the soil and you're bringing some of them up to the surface where they can be exposed to light, so they get their zap of red light, and then all of a sudden all these weed seeds germinate and you end up with something that looks like the scene in the picture to the right. So it's red light that those weed seeds need for germination, just like lettuce seeds require red light for germination as well. Okay, and finally we can do case study number 4, light-sensitive seeds that are planted too deep. So let's say that you decide that you want to maybe try to germinate some lettuce seeds, and you happen to have a variety or cultivar of lettuce that is sensitive to light and requires light for germination, if you sow those seeds too deep, or if you cover them up too much, then the seeds are just simply not going to germinate. So even though the soil moisture is good and you may have the correct temperature and you have good aeration, which are the requirements for seed germination, the seeds still will not germinate because they're not being exposed to red light, simply because they were buried too deep. Okay, so those were just 4 pretty simple case studies that I wanted to use to illustrate how the phytochrome system can work in plants, and there are many, many, many more examples. Another example of the phytochrome system working in plants is photoperiodism in flowering. So we said earlier that plants that are photoperiodic, those plant species respond to photoperiod, and that's a trigger for flowering. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at that. So as it turns out, research has shown that it's the length of the uninterrupted dark period that's really critical. You know, because we define photoperiod as being the amount of light that a plant gets in a 24-hour period, but it's really the length of the dark period that is the actual trigger for flowering in photoperiodic plants. Also, earlier in the class, we talked about the fact that plants go through different phases of growth, and we talked about the juvenile phase, the transitional phase of growth, and the adult phase of growth. And just to refresh your memory, we said that in the juvenile phase of growth, the plant can grow vegetatively, and it has the ability to produce cuttings that will root readily, but it does not flower in the juvenile phase of its growth. So finally, when the plant reaches the adult phase of its growth, it is able to flower. It still grows vegetatively. It produces, shoots with leaves, but you can't propagate it from cuttings as well as you could have when it was in the juvenile phase of growth. So how long the juvenile phase of growth lasts in a species is going to be dependent on, which species you're talking about. So some plant species, you can grow through the juvenile phase into the adult phase in less than a month. Other plant species, it may take several years for you to reach the adult phase of growth. So plants cannot flower in the juvenile phase of growth. We already talked about that. So when the plant finally does reach the adult phase of growth, it is finally receptive to the photoperiod. It's receptive to that uninterrupted dark period that will trigger flowering. And it's the critical night length that is the actual trigger. And what literally happens is when the plant is exposed to a long enough dark period or night period, the shoot apical meristem changes into a floral meristem, which in turn can develop into flowers. All right, so we can take all species of plants and we can put them into 3 groups. One group is referred to as being day neutral plants. The second group we call long day plants. And the third group we call short day plants. So let's look at these 3 groups and see if we can understand some of their characteristics. So day neutral plants, those species can initiate flowers under a wide range of day lengths. So in other words, those species of plants are non-photoperiodic, which means that the photoperiod, or the length of the dark period, is not the trigger that causes flowering. So they can initiate flowers under a wide range of day lengths. So they flower regardless of the photoperiod. And some examples of plants that fall into this day neutral category are cucumbers, ever-bearing strawberries, sweet corn, dandelions, and some tropical foliage plants. So I'm sure there are many, many other species as well, but these were some that I discovered in my research. Okay, long day plants are photoperiodic. They do respond to photoperiod, and photoperiod, or the length of that uninterrupted dark period, is going to be a trigger for flowering. So the way you need to understand long day plants is if you're calling it a long day plant, then it's really a short night plant. So look at the bottom of those three pictures. It says long day, and then in parentheses it says short night. So in order for these species to flower, they have to have a short, uninterrupted period of darkness. Well, how short a period of darkness do they require? Well, as it turns out, photoperiodic species have what's called a critical night length, and the critical night length can vary from species to species. So in this example that we're looking at here, this particular species of plant has a critical night length of 12 hours. All right, so if this is a long day plant, or aka a short night plant, then if the nights are shorter than the critical night length, the plant will flower. So if you look at the column to the left, the critical night length is 12 hours, and the uninterrupted period of darkness is 10 hours. So 10 hours is less than 12 hours. That means that the plant will flower under those circumstances, and then you can see the plant is in bloom in that far left column. If you move over to the center column, the critical night length is still 12 hours. That stays the same. That's species dependent. And in this case, the dark period is 14 hours. So the dark period is longer than the critical night length, so the plant will not flower. All right, and then finally in the column over to the right, we have the critical night length at 12 hours. And we have a dark period that is longer than 12 hours. So really the plant shouldn't flower, but what happened is there was a period of light that interrupted the dark period. And you can see that as that kind of band of yellow that's kind of moving across the dark period just above the number 14. So because that plant was exposed to light during its dark period, it's like it sort of erased the effect of that dark period, and the plant will go ahead and flower. So also notice that in each column, if you start out on the left hand side, 10 plus 14 equals the 24 hours in a day, 14 plus 10, 24 hours, and so on. So we're just kind of breaking a day up into a lighted period and a dark period. So long day plants, aka those short night plants, are plant species that include many spring and early summer flowering plants. All right, and then the third group of plants that we want to look at, they're called short day plants, so we have to kind of reverse that in our minds. And if you look at the bottom of the diagram, it says in parentheses long night. So short day plants are plants that require a long night of uninterrupted darkness in order to flower. So in this case, the species that we're looking at has a critical night length of 12 hours. And if you look at the column on the left, in a 24-hour period, we're giving this plant light for 14 hours and darkness for 10. So in order for this plant to flower, it has to have a long night. So the night has to be longer than 12 hours for the plant to flower. Well, in the case on the left, the night is shorter than 12 hours, so the plant does not flower. In the middle column, the night period is 14 hours long. Okay, that is longer than the critical night length of 12, which means that the plant will flower. And then finally, over in the right-hand column, we have a dark period of 14 hours, but it's been interrupted by a flash of light. And you can see where that's indicated on the diagram. So even though the night is long, because the night period was interrupted by that flash of light, it sort of like negates that dark period and the plant does not flower. So short day plants include a lot of the plants that we grow in the landscape that flower in late summer or early fall. And it also includes many important greenhouse crops that we grow in the greenhouse and sell. And these can include species like poinsettias, chrysanthemums, and kalanchoe. So all three of those plants are what we call short day plants or long night plants. All right, so outside it's practically impossible to control the photoperiod because we'd have to, cover plants up with tarps in order to control the photoperiod, in order to control how much light they got in a 24-hour period. And generally we don't do that. But in a greenhouse, we can control the photoperiod. And one of the ways that we can do that is by using artificial lights. So if we want to extend the photoperiod and make it longer, we can have those artificial lights come on just at sunset or dusk, and they can extend the photoperiod and make it longer if that's what we desire to do. Or some greenhouses are equipped with blackout shade cloths. So if you look at the picture on the right, you see that the blackout shade cloths are starting to descend, and this can be all done automatically. So that can block out light, so that can create a shorter photoperiod if you desire that for growing your crop. So those are different ways that we can control photoperiod in a greenhouse situation. All right, finally we'll end this lecture video by talking about phototropism and geotropism. So tropisms in general are how plants respond to external stimuli. So in the case of phototropism, the external stimulus would be light. In the case of geotropism, the external stimulus would be gravity. Phototropism is the tropism where plants bend towards a light source. And it's commonly seen in sun-loving species of plants. A lot of shade-loving or shade-tolerant species show little or no phototropic response. So let's see how phototropism works. All right, in this picture, you're looking at two shoots. Remember, we defined a shoot as being a young stem with leaves. Well, these are shoots, but they just don't have any leaves on them. So if you look at the shoot on the left, that shoot is kind of illuminated by a light source from above. Okay, so the light is sort of evenly spread over the surface of the shoot. So there's a hormone that's produced in shoots called auxin. And when the shoot is illuminated from above, then the auxin spreads equally down both sides of the plant, and the plant more or less continues to grow straight up. All right, if you look at the illustration on the right-hand side, this particular shoot is being illuminated from the right. That's the light source there. So this could be similar to you maybe having a plant near a window, and the plant kind of bends towards the light, bends towards the window. All right, so in the case on the right, where the plant is illuminated from the side, auxin begins to collect on the shady side, and that auxin causes the cells on the shady side to elongate, to lengthen, to stretch out, and that causes the shoot to bend towards the light source. So I have another diagram that illustrates this as well. In this picture, you have a shoot which is green, and then the auxin, IAA, is illustrated by the purple dots. So auxin is produced by the tip of that shoot. And if you look at column number 1, the light source, or the sun, is pretty much directly overhead. So the auxin is more or less distributed equally on both sides of the shoot, and the shoot continues to grow straight. In column number 2, the light source has moved, and auxin starts to migrate and concentrate on the darker side of the shoot, so the side that is not illuminated by the light. In column number 3, the light source has moved even further, and we have a lot of auxin on the dark side of the shoot, which causes those cells to elongate more, and as a consequence, the shoot tip bends towards the light. And then finally, in column number 4, all the auxin now is on the darker side of the shoot, causing that shoot to bend towards the light. So here are some pictures of plants showing phototropism. So you can see how this plant is definitely bending towards the window, which is the source of light. And the same with these daffodils. These daffodils are kind of leaning towards the light source. So this is phototropism, and it's caused by the concentration of a plant hormone called auxin on the darker side, or the non-illuminated side of the shoot. All right, almost done. The last thing we want to talk about is a different type of tropism called geotropism. And geotropism refers to the fact that roots will grow down in response to gravity. And auxin, again, is known to play a role in geotropism like it does in phototropism. And geotropism is an important event because it helps the root system of a seedling orientate itself after germination. All right, so here are two plants. They're both in a pot. Essentially, you're looking at the same plant. So in the picture on the left, the pot is upright as it should be, and the root system of this plant grows down in response to gravity. If you were to take the plant and tip it on its side, like you see on the right, two things are going to happen. One is phototropism is going to cause the shoot to bend up towards the light source. And geotropism is going to cause the root system to bend down in response to gravity. And you can see those changes by looking at the picture. And then finally, we'll end with this look at corn seeds. So when a farmer's out planting corn seeds in his field sometime in May, you know, those seeds are dropping into the soil in all different kinds of positions. And remember that the living part of the seed is called the embryo, and that the embryo is the part that germinates and becomes the new seedling. So, you know, that embryo could be facing up, it could be facing down, it could be to the right, or it could be to the left, you know, all depending on just chance and how the seed fell out of the seeding machine into the soil. But regardless of how the seed was planted in the soil, the shoot is going to grow up and the root is going to grow down. So if you look at the little corn seed over on the left-hand side, the shoot's going up, and the root, even though it was positioned on top, it bends over and starts growing down. And then in the middle picture, the shoot's going up, the root's going down. And in the right, same thing. The shoot goes up, root goes down. So the shoot is responding to light, that's phototropism. The root system is responding to gravity, that is geotropism. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of our lecture. Thanks for watching.